Hello. So I'm continuing my series on how can we improve better female representation specifically in the movies, and also what would that look like? What does it mean to have good representation? What do we actually want to see more of? Well, I started my last video with a question of how many movies do with female protagonists can be considered great. Movies with female protagonists where there's a general consensus. These are great films. To answer that question, or at least to go, to get further along the road to trying to come up with an answer to that question, I consulted the American Film Institute's list of 100 years, 100 movies. Now, this specifically focuses on American films, so European films, Japanese films, Chinese films, um, other films from other countries don't figure into this list. But still, the AFI is a reputable body, and they've done a lot of these 100 years, 100 something other lists. So I went through the titles, looked at them one at a time, thought about what they are, what kind of stories they tell. And of these 100 films, I counted 23 that have female protagonists. 23 out of 100 movies that merited a spot on the 100 years, 100 movies list. Only 23 had female leads. So I then looked at those 23 and I found that of those 23, in 15 of these movies, the female lead functions not as a sole protagonist, but as a co-protagonist. A situation where the female lead shares the spotlight with a male lead, where they're basically both protagonists, they both have growth arcs, and they both have a similar amount of screen time. And these are movies like Bonnie and Clyde, West Side Story, The African Queen, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Bringing Up Baby, Titanic, The Apartment. You get the idea. A lot of them are romantic films or dark takes on romantic films. So, how many of these movies, how many of these greatest American films of all time have a female protagonist who is the protagonist? It is, without a doubt, her story. She is the center of things. 8. Only 8. 8 great films that have a female protagonist who carries the film by herself, her own story, unequivocally her story. Only 8. Now, there is nothing we can do about the past because, well, I've looked over the list and I cannot say that any of the movies on that list don't deserve to be there. If I were going to rewrite the list, I don't know what I'd take out. So the problem isn't the past. We have the films we have. The problem isn't the past. The problem is the present and the future. How do we get better stories with female leads? We start by looking at the problems. Why have we not gotten this so far? And in my last video, I talked about the issue with a double standard where movies made for boys are considered universal in their appeal. Movies made for girls are considered niche. They are just for girls and only girls would enjoy them. And it isn't necessarily the kids making these choices on their own. They are encouraged by parents and sometimes even teachers. to think of boys' stories as more important, more valuable because they do speak to everyone. Whereas since girls' stories speak only to girls, they're not quite as important. They're not quite as valuable. They don't have the same merit. So another problem that tends to go hand in hand with that is the concept of male as default. So what this means is that when you have a character in a story where gender is irrelevant to the role they play in the story, that character will default to male. So if your gender doesn't matter in a story, you're going to be male. And this is why in children's literature and in children's films, the stories that boys and girls take in during their most formative years, you tend to have a lot of characters who are male who could have easily been female. We get little golden books like Scruffy the Tugboat. Who says tugboats have gender at all? But he's referred to with male pronouns. We got the Pokey Little Puppy. You've got Little Cottontail. All these characters whose gender isn't even addressed in the story. And because it isn't addressed, because it doesn't matter, those characters are male. And this leads to a situation where characters in a story are only female because they have to be, because the story demands it, because they play some sort of gendered role. So what that means, or what that has meant for many and many a generation, is that while male characters can essentially be and do anything, you have female characters squeezed into mom roles or love interest roles, or sometimes femme fatale or villain roles. Even in movies made for family audiences, you do have the femme fatale, the villain in the story. And those are characters whose gender factors into the plot, factors into their identity, so that they seem to have, and this is one of the reasons why, when I was growing up and reading these books and watching these films, I always identified more with the male characters in those stories than I did with the female characters, because I liked how free the male characters seemed to be. I liked the fact that there was nothing they couldn't be, nothing they couldn't do. That freedom was really what I envied. I didn't necessarily envy masculine roles or masculine traits where you do have gendered male roles. Those characters didn't really interest me either. It was more the characters for whom gender was irrelevant. Those were the characters I envied. And in my head, I switched them, I flipped them, I imagined them as female just because I kind of needed them to be that way. I didn't flip them for anybody else. It was solely in my imagination that I made these characters what at the time I needed them to be, because I needed to believe that girl characters, female characters, could have that same kind of freedom to be anything, to do anything that the male characters in these stories always seem to have. And I don't think I'm alone either, because when we talk about men writing women, we talk about how men don't really get women, or men don't really see women as full three-dimensional people. Well, when you're brought up with these images, I can see why that would be a hard thing to do, because you've only ever seen, at least in the stories you take in, you've only ever seen female characters playing these prescriptively gendered roles rather than just being people for whom gender is just one of many traits and characteristics. So you take this in. This becomes a part of your way of thinking. And it is hard to push back against that conditioning. This is one of the reasons why it's not just men who have trouble coming up with stronger, and that word strong is overused, but I'll just replace it with who have trouble coming up with interesting and active female characters who are the kind that audiences, regardless of what gender the audience is, that the audience is going to want to identify with, to root for, or to attach with or engage with emotionally. Even women sometimes, or at least some women, sometimes have trouble writing those characters. So that we get stories that are ostensibly for women that don't really represent or at least don't craft their female characters with very much skill. So this is what we're up against. It's important that we know this is going on. Again, that we know there's the double standard, that conditions young boys growing up not to identify with female characters or their stories, not to see those stories as important, not to see those stories as relevant to their experience. And then on the other hand, you have the male as default, which places limits, often strict limits, on what female characters can do and be. This is what we need to fight against. This is what we need to use our creative power to challenge. So, coming up next, I'm going to talk about some of the things that we might want to see, some of the things we don't really see as much as we would like to, but that we hope to see more often in the female characters we encounter in the movies. Thank you very much.